Welcome to Xi Jinping briefing. The content of the briefing includes: Xi visits Vietnam as China seeks to counter U.S. influence. Rand Paul puts Senate on record on Syria, war powers. Flashpoint is South China Sea, not Taiwan, Philippine envoy to U.S. Oops. U.S. President Joe Biden mixes up his Chinese leaders. U.S. and China must seize opening to discuss military AI risks. Xi visits Vietnam as China seeks to counter U.S. influence. Deutsche Welle. Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Vietnam and signed 37 deals on diplomatic relations, railways, and telecommunications projects. However, 8 deals tied to critical and rare materials were left unsigned. The visit comes as China and the U.S. compete for influence in the region, with the U.S. recently upgrading relations with Vietnam to a comprehensive strategic partnership. China and Vietnam agreed to build a community with a shared future but debated the true meaning of the phrase. Vietnam has deep trade ties with China but has sided with the U.S. in its assessment of Beijing's behavior in the region, particularly in the South China Sea. Rand Paul puts Senate on record on Syria, war powers. Washington Post. Following the crisis in Ukraine, the debate over who has the power to send American forces into harm's way has been reignited. President Biden sent Congress his semi-annual letter, required by the War Powers Act of 1973, outlining where combat-equipped U.S. troops are deployed in conflict zones. Rand Paul, Republican Kentucky, forced the Senate to vote on whether U.S. forces should be withdrawn from Syria. Paul claimed that the Senate had abdicated their role and that the legislature should vote on whether the military should be deployed. The resolution failed, but Paul intends to reintroduce the matter to the Senate in the future. Paul argued that Congress should have a say in whether military action is taken, suggesting that the legislature should be voting on such matters, which would make members accountable for the actions of the military. Paul believes that the bipartisan consensus in Washington is very bellicose. He suggested that the Trump period of office led to the coalition that once existed between progressive and libertarian lawmakers to deteriorate. Paul felt that the left-wing media had pilloried House members that suggested negotiating with Ukraine, suggesting that it was so unacceptable to talk about negotiation. The last time Congress declared war was in 1942 against Bulgaria, Hungary and Romania. Since then lawmakers have relied on authorization for use of military force. In the case of Syria, there has been no authorization. The stakes of this debate are particularly high given that next year the U.S. will decide who will be the commander-in-chief. Flashpoint is South China Sea, not Taiwan, Philippine envoy to U.S. Nikkei Asia. The South China Sea is a major conflict waiting to happen, warns the Philippine ambassador to the U.S. José Manuel Romualdez told Nikkei Asia that a skirmish between Philippine and Chinese vessels could be the start of another world war. The Philippines accused China of using water cannons and ramming Manila's ships. The skirmishes followed a meeting between Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping in which Marcos Jr. tried to manage tensions in the waterway. Oops. U.S. President Joe Biden mixes up his Chinese leaders. South China Morning Post. U.S. President Joe Biden faced criticism on social media after mistakenly referring to former Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping instead of current President Xi Jinping during a speech. Users on platforms like Twitter and Weibo commented on the mistake, with some suggesting that Biden's team would be concerned about the impact on his election campaign. The mistake was later corrected in the White House transcript. Biden did have a meeting with Deng in 1979 when he was a senator, and he has also frequently mentioned his conversations with Xi. U.S. and China must seize opening to discuss military AI risks. Nikkei Asia. The U.S. and China should engage in dialogue to mitigate the risks posed by rapidly advancing military AI systems, according to Sam Bresnick, a research fellow with the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown University in Washington. The two countries have each designated AI as a cornerstone of their military modernization strategies, yet China has not yet engaged in dialogue with the U.S. on this issue. Bresnick suggests that the U.S. should engage China on limiting the use of AI in the nuclear domain and in discussions on establishing standards for testing AI systems. 3 months after Biden, it's Xi's turn to court Vietnam. New York Times. Chinese President Xi Jinping has arrived in Vietnam on a visit that signals the country's importance in the U.S.-China power struggle. Vietnam is in a high-risk position, as it must try to please both nations without angering either one, as the consequences of doing so could be heavy. Xi has been pressuring Vietnam to join what China calls a community of common destiny, a phrase it introduced a decade ago to help reassure regional support and reduce distrust among Southeast Asian nations, but Vietnam has thus far resisted, fearing that membership would imply acceptance of Chinese hegemony. "I have no future," China's rebel influencer is still paying a price. New York Times. Li Ying, a young Chinese activist, has become a prominent figure in the fight against Chinese censorship and tyranny. He turned his Twitter account into an information clearinghouse, using the social media platform to broadcast photos, videos, and witness accounts that would otherwise be censored in China. His actions earned him a large following on Twitter and made him a target of the Chinese state. Li has faced numerous personal consequences for his activism, including receiving death threats, having his Chinese accounts frozen, and being unable to return to China. He continues to use Twitter to inform the Chinese public about news that is not covered by the heavily censored media, spending up to 6 hours a day on the platform. Li believes that the White Paper movement, which sparked widespread protests in China, was not the end but the beginning of something larger. He sees signs that the Chinese people are realizing their right to fight for what they want and that cracks are appearing in China's Great Firewall. Despite the risks and personal sacrifices, Li remains committed to his activism and hopes for a more democratic and open society in China. The Dragon Roars Back: Transformational Leaders and Dynamics of Chinese Foreign Policy. Foreign Affairs. The author of this article challenges the realist theory that China's foreign policy is determined solely by its geostrategic position and the balance of power. Instead, the author argues that events such as the Sino-Soviet split and China's embrace of globalization were shaped by the visions of transformational leaders. The author also criticizes Chinese leader Xi Jinping's aggressive diplomacy and naval buildup, seeing them as policy errors driven by a resentful strain of nationalism. The author suggests that this confrontational approach has isolated China and put it in a weaker position against the United States. How to China-proof the global economy? Foreign Affairs. The United States needs to adopt a new approach to its economic strategy towards China, according to a new report by Kurt M. Campbell and Rush Doshi in Foreign Affairs. The report argues that Washington should accept that the Xi regime will not change and instead actively manage the economic relationship with China to advance specific U.S. interests and respond to evolving geopolitical demands. The authors propose a more targeted and sophisticated economic model that tailors policies to achievable goals and uses a variety of creative tools. This includes reducing U.S. reliance on China in major supply chains, ensuring the West maintains an edge in sensitive technologies, and establishing new trading relationships with like-minded partners. The report also highlights the need for the United States to develop a sectoral trade strategy, focusing on specific sectors where interests converge, and to address the digital economy and emerging technologies. Additionally, the report emphasizes the importance of providing economic and infrastructure support to U.S. partners and allies as a way to compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative. Finally, the report urges the United States to reinforce the dominance of the dollar in global trade and finance to slow the rise of alternative reserve currencies. In some countries, 4 in 5 kids become short-sighted. How do we avoid the same fate? The Sydney Morning Herald. Chinese children are suffering from increasing levels of myopia, or short-sightedness, due to spending too much time indoors on study notes. The World Health Organization has predicted that half of the global population will have myopia by 2050. Myopia occurs when the eyeball grows too long, causing light to focus just in front of the retina instead of directly on it. This can cause blurred vision and increases the risk of more serious ocular issues such as glaucoma and retinal detachment. Researchers have been investigating various treatments for myopia, including atropine eye drops, orthokeratology, a retainer-like treatment, and red light therapy. Atropine eye drops have been found to slow the progression of myopia, but they can have side effects such as blurred vision and stinging eyes. Orthokeratology has been found to temporarily reshape the eyeball, correcting elongation, but it requires the use of special contact lenses. Red light therapy has also been found to slow the progression of myopia, but more research is needed to understand its effects on eye shape. The best prevention for myopia is spending time outside, as exposure to natural daylight delays its onset. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Dr. Six, your trusted observer from the 6-degree world, here to bring you the latest news from around the globe. Today, we witnessed a range of intriguing stories that shed light on the ever-evolving dynamics of international relations, the challenges of democratic activism, and even the health of our children's eyesight. So, let's dive right in. First, we saw Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to Vietnam, where he signed numerous deals but left some critical ones unsigned. This visit comes as China and the US vie for influence in the region, with Vietnam caught in the middle. It's like a high-stakes game of tug-of-war, and Vietnam is the rope. The true meaning of their agreed-upon community with a shared future remains a point of contention, highlighting the delicate balance Vietnam must maintain between its deep trade ties with China and its alignment with the US. Next, Senator Rand Paul shook things up in the U.S. Senate by forcing a vote on whether American forces should be withdrawn from Syria. He argued that Congress should have a say in military actions, bringing attention to the often overlooked role of the legislature in matters of war. It seems like the good senator wants to remind his colleagues that they can't just sit back and let the executive branch make all the decisions. After all, as they say, with great power comes great responsibility, and a vote in Congress. In the South China Sea, tensions are rising, and the Philippine ambassador to the U.S. warns that a skirmish between Philippine and Chinese vessels could potentially escalate into another world war. Yikes! It's like a scene out of an action movie, except this time, the stakes are real. This serves as a stark reminder that conflicts in this region have far-reaching consequences and should not be taken lightly. On a lighter note, we had a chuckle as U.S. President Joe Biden mixed up his Chinese leaders during a speech. It seems President Biden's memory is playing tricks on him, and he accidentally referred to former leader Deng Xiaoping instead of the current president Xi Jinping. Oops! Let's hope his team has a good sense of humor and that this slip-up doesn't cause too much trouble for his election campaign. Moving on, we learned that the US and China should engage in dialogue to address the risks posed by military AI systems. The rapid advancement of AI technology has raised concerns, and it's crucial that these two global powers come together to establish standards and limitations. Otherwise, we might end up with a real-life Terminator situation, and nobody wants that. In China, we saw the inspiring story of Li Ying, a young activist fighting against censorship and tyranny. Despite facing personal consequences like death threats and frozen accounts, Li continues to use social media to inform the Chinese public about news that is otherwise censored. He is a true hero, standing up for what he believes in and fighting for a more democratic and open society. Keep it up, Li. You're making a difference, one tweet at a time. In the realm of foreign policy, we had an interesting article challenging the notion that China's actions are solely driven by geopolitical factors. The author argues that transformational leaders play a significant role in shaping China's foreign policy, and he criticizes President Xi Jinping's confrontational approach. It seems like even in international relations, leadership matters, and not all dragons roar the same way. Speaking of dragons, we must discuss the US-China economic relationship. According to a report in Foreign Affairs, the United States needs to adopt a new approach to its economic strategy towards China. The report suggests actively managing the economic relationship to advance specific US interests and respond to geopolitical demands. It's like playing a game of chess, where every move counts, and the stakes are high. Let's hope the players have their thinking caps on. Lastly, we learned about the rising levels of myopia in Chinese children, attributed to spending too much time indoors. The World Health Organization predicts that half the global population will have myopia by 2050. That's a lot of people squinting at their screens. Researchers are exploring various treatments, but the best prevention is simple: go outside and soak up some natural daylight. Remember, kids, the world is not just pixels on a screen. And there you have it, folks. A whirlwind of news from around the world. Remember, these stories are just the tip of the iceberg, and there's so much more to explore and discuss. So, tell me, what are your thoughts on these stories? Do you have any burning questions? Let's open the floor and dive into a lively discussion. The 6-Degree World awaits your input. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.